Hey class, we're in chapter 6. This is part 7. Lots of parts, it's a big chapter. So we are right at the point where it gets interesting with regards to who is responsible for what. And that is, what if we have a situation where both sides can take precaution? It's not a strict liability, no liability, but it is a circumstance where it is reasonable for both sides to take precaution, and therefore you look and see whether they took enough precaution. And that's what we're going to be exploring here in a lot of different ways. So all of this goes back to that social cost curve, which is expected social cost curve because we have a probability associated with the accident, which depends upon the level of precaution that is taken. So when we have a circumstance where both parties can take precaution, the relationship looks like this. And that is the expected social cost is equal to the amount of precaution taken by the victim times the cost of that precaution, plus the amount of precaution taken by the injurer times the cost of that, plus the probability of an accident, which is now a function of both the victim and the injurer times the damage associated with the accident. So this is the key thing that changes here, because now the probability of an accident happening depends not only on what you do, but what the other party does. And therefore, we've got a situation of what we call bilateral precaution. And even though it's going to be efficient for both parties to take precaution, as you could well see here, are you going to internalize the social cost? No, because you can't control what the other party ends up doing. Okay. I hope you're not getting distracted by my t-shirt. I got it when I took my son to a Mets game in Queens back in 2015. These are several logos associated with the Mets over the years. That's Mr. Met, by the way. Not that any of you care. Okay. So taking what we did here, in looking at precaution as it applies to one party, both parties, whatever, we can start to think in terms of a negligence rule. So we're going to visualize it first, and then we're going to lay out a bunch of very simple algebraic relationships that lay out how we think about precaution. So I want to go back to the diagram that we had where we first showed what the expected social cost curve looks like. Okay. Remember that? That's the big one. You understand this, you'll be in pretty good shape on torts. You have trouble with this, it's going to be a problem. Okay, so make sure that you're really comfortable with this relationship here. Why this is the minimum point, why we take these two different costs into account, understand the trade-off between taking precaution, which is the cost, and the lower probability of an accident, which is the payout. Okay, so we're going to take this diagram, and now we're going to decompose it into a situation where we look at what the costs are that are really relevant to the party that takes precaution, depending upon whether they are taking enough precaution or too little precaution. So we're redrawing the diagram, but now we've got some bold sections and we've got some dashed sections. So again, the top curve is the one that takes into account not only the cost of precaution, but the other curve, which I haven't drawn here, and that is the probability of an accident times the damages from an accident. And that probability is a declining function of the amount of precaution that you take. So here is the key reference point, and that's going to be X tilde, which is the legal standard. And we're going to assume for now that X star, the efficient standard, is set at the legal standard. We will relax that assumption a little bit later on in the chapter. So what all this shows is the cost to the individual. If you are in the forbidden zone, where you are taking less than the legal amount of precaution that you are required, so you're going to be found negligent here, then you're going to be on the hook for both the damages, the expected damages associated with an accident because you didn't take enough precaution, and whatever level of precaution you did take, and that's going to be the solid part of the curve. Once you hit X star, X tilde, which is the legal standard, but also the efficient level of precaution, we're going to just assume they're one and the same for a while, then the only cost that is relevant is going to be the cost associated with precaution, because you're not going to be held responsible for the accident, but you still are on the hook for whatever costs are associated with the precaution that you took. So it's the two solid parts that matter, and it should be really obvious. What do you do here? Right at the legal standard, no more, no less. Any less, it's more expensive. Any more, unnecessary precaution. Okay. Now, again, that assumes that we know exactly what the consequence of taking precaution is. We are accurate in estimating both the cost of precaution and the damages associated, expected damages associated with precaution. We can deal with other circumstances a little bit later on in that situation. Okay, so if the injurer is not liable, the victim's going to get no compensation, even though they are suffering damages because the other side did not do anything that is viewed as being wrong. So what we can do now is we can start to think in terms of a bunch of rules that will determine who is responsible, depending upon what the legal standard happens to be. Okay, so we're going to start with. I'm running out of space for just little chunks here, so we'll keep it kind of at the bottom. A simple negligence rule: the injurer is going to be liable if they took too little precaution. Okay, so if XI is less than XI star, then they're going to be on the hook negligence, and that's the only thing that we need to show is negligence, and that is a very simple rule. It's a very strict rule. Doesn't take into account the actions of the other party. Okay. Now, we can relax that a little bit by taking a look at contributory negligence. This takes us back to the Butterfield case, because you remember in the Butterfield case, even though the party's guilty of, sticking the log out in the road, because the rider on the horse was going too fast, he was contributorily negligent and therefore did not collect. Okay. That's going to be what we have on the bottom here. So with contributory negligence, we've got a circumstance where the injurer is liable if he or she takes into account too little precaution, that's the injurer, and the victim takes at least the efficient level of precaution. We're efficient and the law trumps everything. But we're going to assume the efficient level and the legal standard are the same. Okay, so X star and X tilde are going to be exactly the same. You're not going to be liable if you have taken a sufficient amount of precaution, and I'm not even sure this is even relevant. I know it's in the book, but if you've taken the sufficient level of precaution, end of story, but it certainly kind of seals the deal in terms of convincing a jury. If you've been safe and then you prove that the other side has not been safe because the victim took too little precaution. Okay, so that should kind of make sense for you. So think about this again. Contributory negligence, we're looking at the contribution by the parties in terms of their actions. And so we look at not only what the injurer did, we also look at what the victim did. Okay, the final thing that we're going to be dealing with for the moment, because we've got a lot of different variations on a theme here, but the natural evolution of the concept of contributory negligence is comparative negligence. And comparative negligence is closer to the way things are actually done now. And comparative negligence takes into account a special circumstance. So we start exactly where we were before, that the injurer is 100% liable if they took too little precaution and the victim took enough. The victim is 100% liable if the injurer took enough precaution. That probably seals the deal, and most certainly if they didn't take enough precaution. But then we get to the interesting one, and that's going to be the bottom line here, and that is proportionate liability. What if neither party took sufficient precaution? So XI is less than XI star, and XV is also less than XV star. So that's important here, because now you've got neither party that's pure in this situation. So what do you do in this situation? This is a situation that comes up a lot. Let me refer to the book, and then I'm going to give you a real-world example on a case we've already talked about. In the footnote on page 209 of the book, the authors have a suggestion, and this is a circumstance where, let's say the speed limit is 30 miles an hour. One party is going 35 miles an hour, and the other party is going 40 miles an hour. Both of them are speeding, okay? One is 5 miles over the speed limit. The other's 10 miles over the speed limit. 35 minus 30 versus 40 minus 30. So collectively, they're 15 miles over the speed limit. One party is a third of that, 5 over 15. The other party is 2/3 of that, 10 over 15. So a simple-minded way of looking at proportional liability might be 1/3 to the party that's going 35, 2/3 that goes to the party that's going 40. In the real world, that's probably too simplistic, because the higher the speed, the increasing rate at which you have harm from an accident. So in likelihood, the one that's going faster probably would be more than 2/3 responsible. Okay, let me give you a real-world example of comparative negligence. We're going to go back to the Skrillex case. I looked that up yesterday, and in that case where there was a gross award of about $4.5 million, first off, the plaintiff herself was found by the jury to be 15% negligent. So 15% of her damages were due to her actions in being in the mosh pit, being very close to the stage, understanding that that's not as safe an environment to be as if she was further back in the concert hall. The other 85% was split between three of the defendants. 10% went to the theater. So the argument is, the theater should have seen that if people were crowded too close together, there may be injury or whatever, but it wasn't their main responsibility, but they were at least somewhat negligent. That leaves 75% of the allocation of liability to a portion. And my recollection is 35% went to Skrillex. Remember, he's the one who jumped off of the mixing board into the crowd. And 40% went to his touring company, the company that organized his whole tour. And they were the ones who were viewed by the jury as being the most responsible for having set up a safe environment for the concert tour. And obviously they didn't, right? Obviously, it is up to the jury to determine, and it's subjective to be sure, but it's a good way of illustrating the concept of proportionate liability and comparative negligence. Okay, we'll pick this up in part 8.